The cold came from below. That was the thing nobody understood about dying in Montana. People thought it was the wind that killed you, the blizzards that buried whole homesteads under 15 feet of snow, the storms that turned the sky white and the world into nothing. But Dorothea Blackwell knew better. She had watched her husband John die 6 months earlier, crushed under a widowmaker pine that fell the wrong way. And in the months since, she had learned what real cold felt like. It rose up through the floorboards like something alive. It crawled through the 6-inch gap between the cabin floor and the frozen earth beneath, stealing heat from every corner, every breath, every moment. The fire could blaze in the stone hearth until the chimney glowed orange, and still the cold would win. It always won. Because heat rises and cold pools, and the cabin floor was nothing but pine planks set on cedar posts, and beneath those planks was nothing but air and darkness and November frost. Thea woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of her son trying to breathe. She was already moving before she was fully awake, her bare feet hitting the floor, the cold shocking through her like electricity. The cabin was a single room 14 by 18 feet, and she crossed it in 4 strides. The fire had burned down to coals. The temperature inside was maybe 35 degrees. Outside it was 12 below zero. Nathaniel was 5 years old. Everyone called him Nate. He lay curled on his side on the sleeping platform he shared with his sister, wrapped in every blanket Thea owned, and he was making a sound she had never heard before. Not quite coughing, not quite choking. Something wet and desperate and wrong. She knelt beside him, her hand on his forehead, burning hot. His whole body shaking, muscles clenched tight against the cold that no amount of fever could warm. Nate, baby, look at me. His eyes opened, unfocused. He tried to say something but couldn't get enough air. His lips were blue at the edges. Beatrice sat up beside him. 8 years old, small for her age, dark hair tangled from sleep. Mama, get me the lamp and more wood. Bee moved fast. Good girl. She had learned not to ask questions in the middle of the night. Thea lifted Nate into her arms, blankets and all, and carried him to the chair by the fire. He weighed nothing. Had he always been this light? She couldn't remember. She fed the fire, built it back up, held her son close. His breathing was ragged, each inhale a fight. She pressed her ear to his chest and heard the rattle deep in his lungs. Pneumonia. Or worse. She had seen it before in other children that winter. Some of them lived. Most didn't. Bee stood beside her, holding the oil lamp, her face pale in the flickering light. Is Nate going to die? Thea looked at her daughter, looked at her son, felt the cold rising through the floor beneath her feet. No, she said. He's not. But she had no idea if that was true. The sun came up gray and cold at 7:30. Thea hadn't moved from the chair. Nate had finally fallen into something like sleep, his breathing still shallow and wet. Bee had curled up on the floor beside them, wrapped in her own blanket. her hand resting on her brother's foot. Thea watched the light grow through the single window. Ice had formed on the inside of the glass overnight. Intricate patterns like ferns, beautiful and deadly. The cabin temperature had dropped to 32 degrees despite the fire. Water in the wash basin had frozen solid. The floor was so cold it burned to walk on. She had done everything right, everything the neighbors had told her to do. She had packed straw between the floor joists in October, thinking it would insulate against the cold. It hadn't worked. The straw got damp from ground moisture and turned to ice, making things worse. She had hung canvas around the foundation posts, creating a barrier against the wind. The wind just found new ways through, screaming under the cabin at night, like something hunting. She had burned more firewood than she could afford, keeping the fire going around the clock. Her woodpile, which should have lasted until March, was already half gone, and it was only November. Nothing worked. The problem wasn't the fire. The problem was the floor. Heat rises, cold pools, and 6 inches of empty air beneath the cabin floor became a river of freezing wind every night, pulling warmth down and away faster than any fire could replace it. Thea had grown up understanding this. Her father had been a mining engineer, one of the men who designed the deep shaft mines in Butte, back before the copper boom really hit. He used to take her underground when she was a girl, against her mother's protests, showing her how the earth worked, how temperature changed with depth, how at 5 feet down the ground stayed the same temperature year-round, somewhere around 50 degrees. Warm in winter, cool in summer, constant. "The earth doesn't fight you, Thea," he used to say. "It just is. You work with it or you work against it. Your choice." She had been 12 when he died in a tunnel collapse, 20 years ago now. But she still remembered his lessons. She remembered standing in a mine shaft 50 feet underground in the middle of January and being warmer than she was on the surface. She looked at Nate, at B, at the frost growing across the inside of the walls. An idea began to form. Dr. Whitmore arrived at noon, riding his horse through snow that was already knee-deep and getting deeper. He was a thin man, 60 years old, with kind eyes and hands that shook slightly from too much whiskey. But he was the only doctor within 30 miles, and he was competent enough when he was sober. Thea met him at the door, took his coat, poured him coffee from the pot. She kept warm on the stove. He examined Nate without speaking, listening to his lungs, checking his temperature, looking at his fingernails, which had started to turn purple at the tips. Finally, he sat back. "How cold does it get in here at night?" 30 degrees, sometimes lower. "And you keep the fire going. All night. Every night." He nodded slowly. "Mrs. Blackwell, I'm going to be direct with you. Your son has advanced pneumonia. His lungs are full of fluid. His body is using all its energy just trying to stay warm, which means it has nothing left to fight the infection. If he stays in this cabin, if he continues to be exposed to these temperatures, he will not survive the winter." Thea felt something crack open inside her chest. What does he need? Warmth. Consistent warmth. At least 50 degrees, ideally 60. And rest. His body needs to stop fighting the cold so it can fight the disease. How much firewood would that take? More than you have. More than you could afford. Mrs. Blackwell, the problem isn't the fire. It's the cabin. The way it's built with that raised floor, you're essentially living in a chimney. Heat goes up and out. Cold comes in from below. You could burn a cord of wood a day and still freeze. Then what do I do? Dr. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. You need to take him somewhere warmer. Helena, maybe. The hospital there has heated wards. I can't afford that. I know. I'm sorry. He left her 2 bottles of medicine that wouldn't help decline payment he knew she couldn't give, and rode away into the gray afternoon. Thea watched him go from the window, Nate hot and restless in her arms, and felt the weight of everything pressing down. She owed Cornelius Webb $180. Webb owned the general store in town, and he had extended credit to John for supplies last spring before the accident. The debt had passed to her. Webb had given her until Christmas to pay, which was generous by his standards. After that, he would take the cabin and the land. She had nothing else. No money for Helena. No money to pay Webb. No money for more firewood or medicine or anything that might keep her children alive through winter. Just this cabin, this cold, and an idea she wasn't sure would work. That night after Bea had fallen asleep and Nate's fever had dropped slightly, Thea knelt on the floor in the northwest corner of the cabin beneath the sleeping platform. She pried up 3 of the floorboards with a claw hammer, working quietly, and looked down into the crawl space beneath. 6 inches of frozen air. Darkness. The smell of damp earth. She lowered herself down, lamp in hand, and crawled underneath her own home. The ground was hard, frozen solid for the first 2 inches, just like she expected. But her father had taught her that frost doesn't go deep in Montana. The snow comes too early, insulates the ground, keeps the frost line shallow. Beneath the frozen crust, the earth would be softer, calmer, warmer. She took the hammer and drove the claw end into the dirt. It bit through the frost, and beneath the soil gave way. Dark brown, slightly moist, not frozen. She touched it with her bare hand. It was cold, but not painful. Maybe 40 degrees. Warmer than the air above it. Warmer than her cabin floor. 5 feet down, her father had said the earth stays steady, 50 degrees all year long. She crawled back up through the gap in the floor, replaced the boards, and sat there in the dark thinking, what if she went down instead of up? What if she dug beneath the cabin below the wind, below the frost line into that steady warmth? A room small enough to heat with body warmth, and a tiny fire insulated by the earth itself. It was insane. Nobody built underground in Montana. Root cellars, yes, dug into hillsides for storing vegetables. Storm shelters sometimes, but a living space. A bedroom. She looked at Nate sleeping fitfully by the fire. Looked at Bea curled up beside him, insane or not. It was the only idea she had. The next morning she started digging. She worked in the early hours before dawn, when the children were still asleep. She pried up the same 3 floorboards, creating an opening about 2 feet wide and 4 feet long, and lowered herself down into the crawl space with a shovel and a bucket. The frozen crust came up in chunks, hard, stubborn work. Her shoulders ached, her hands blistered, but 8 inches down the soil softened just like her father had promised. She filled the bucket, hauled it up, spread the dirt thin across her garden plot outside where it wouldn't be noticed. She worked slowly, carefully. 2 hours before dawn, 2 hours after the children went to bed at night. She told B she was fixing the foundation. B, 8 years old and too smart for her own good, didn't entirely believe her, but she didn't ask questions either. By the end of the first week, Thea had excavated a space 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 2 feet deep. Not much, but it was a start. She knew what she was trying to build. A room 8 feet long and 6 feet wide, tall enough for her to sit upright, maybe 5.5 feet. Stone walls to prevent collapse and hold heat. A wooden floor to keep them dry. Cedar posts to support the cabin floor above. A ladder for access. And ventilation somehow to keep the air fresh. Simple in concept. Impossible in execution for someone who had never built anything more complicated than a chicken coop. She needed help. She knew that. But who would help a widow dig a hole under her house? Who would even believe it would work? The answer came to her on the 9th day as she was hauling another bucket of dirt up through the floor, and her arms finally gave out. The bucket slipped, crashed back down, and Thea sat there in the pre-dawn dark, breathing hard, hands bleeding through the bandages she'd wrapped around the blisters. She needed someone who understood engineering, someone who knew about drainage, structural loads, ventilation, thermal dynamics, someone with experience building underground. There was only one person in Bitterroot Creek who fit that description. Silas Thornwood. Silas lived alone in a cabin a 1/4 mile downstream, set back in the pines where nobody bothered him. He had been a mining engineer, same as Thea's father, though their paths had never crossed. Silas had worked in the deep copper mines in Butte for 20 years before he retired and moved to Bitterroot Creek. That was 15 years ago. He was 58 now, a widower with no children anyone knew about. And in all those years he had barely spoken to anyone in town. He bought supplies from Webb's store once a month. He attended church on Christmas and Easter. He helped neighbors with their wells and foundations when they asked. But he never smiled, never made conversation, never explained why he'd left Butte or what he was running from. People said his wife had died young. People said he'd been involved in a mine accident that killed several men. People said a lot of things, but nobody knew for sure, and Silas didn't correct them. Thea had spoken to him exactly 3 times in the 6 years she'd lived in Bitterroot Creek. Once at John's funeral, where Silas had offered brief condolences and left. Once at the store where they'd waited in line together and discussed the weather. Once on the trail where he'd tipped his hat and walked past without a word. She had no reason to think he would help her, but she had no other options. She waited until afternoon when the sun was high. and Nate's fever had broken temporarily, and Bee was reading by the fire. She bundled the children up, banked the fire, and walked the quarter-mile through shin-deep snow to Silas Thornwood's cabin. It was smaller than hers, built low and solid against the hillside. Smoke rose from the chimney. Firewood stacked neat and high against the north wall. Everything about it spoke of competence and isolation. She knocked. Silas opened the door after a long moment. He was tall, lean, weathered like old leather. Gray beard, gray hair, gray eyes that showed nothing. He looked at her, then at the children standing behind her in the snow, then back at her. "Mrs. Blackwell, Mr. Thornwood, I need your help." "With what?" "I'm digging a room under my cabin for my children to sleep in, to keep them warm." He blinked once, the only sign of surprise he gave. "A room underground?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because my son is dying from the cold. Because the cabin floor loses all its heat. Because 5 feet down the earth stays at 50 degrees. Because I remember my father telling me that. Because I don't know how to build it right. And you do." Silas was quiet for a long time. Behind Thea, Nate coughed a wet, rattling sound. Silas looked at the boy, then at Thea. "I don't help people anymore, Mrs. Blackwell. I'm not asking for charity. I'll pay you after I sell the spring crop. Or I can work. Cook, mend, whatever you need." "I don't need anything." "Then do it because a child is dying and you know how to prevent it." His jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're asking." "I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you to teach me how to dig a hole in the ground that won't collapse and won't fill with water and won't suffocate my children. That's all. I'll do the work. You just have to tell me how." Silas stared at her. She stared back. Nate coughed again. "Come back tomorrow," Silas said finally. "Bring whatever plans you've drawn. If they're not completely insane, I'll think about it." He closed the door. Thea stood there in the snow, Bee's hand in hers. Nate shivering against her side, and felt something like hope flicker in her chest. She spent that night drawing. Not well. She wasn't an artist, but she sketched out the space as she imagined it using measurements she'd paced off in the crawl space. 8 by 6 feet, 5.5 feet tall, stone walls, wooden floor. She marked where she thought the support posts should go, where the entrance would be, where the ventilation might work. It looked crude, childish almost, but it was something. The next afternoon, she returned to Silas's cabin alone. Bee was watching Nate, who was having a better day. Thea knocked. Silas answered, looked at the rolled paper in her hands, and stepped aside to let her in. His cabin was immaculate. One room like hers, but organized with military precision. Books lined one wall. Engineering texts, mining manuals, technical drawings. A drafting table stood in the corner, covered with dust. Thea unrolled her sketch on the table. Silas studied it without speaking. After a full minute, he said, "You've already started digging." "Yes." "How deep?" 2 feet, 4x6 area. What did you hit? Frozen crust for 8 inches. Then softer soil, dark brown, slightly damp. Water table, I don't know. Bedrock, I don't know. Soil composition, clay content, drainage, rate, I don't know. He looked at her. You're digging blind. Yes. You could hit water at 3 feet and flood the whole space. You could hit rock and have to stop. You could dig too deep and compromise your foundation. You could create a cave-in that brings down your entire cabin. I know. And you're still doing it. I don't have a choice. Silas turned back to the drawing. He picked up a pencil, made a few marks, crossed out her ventilation design, sketched something new. This won't work. The walls will collapse. The floor will flood. And even if it doesn't, you'll suffocate in your sleep. Then teach me how to do it right. He set the pencil down, looked at her. Why me? Because you built tunnels for 20 years. Because you know soil mechanics and structural engineering and ventilation systems. Because you're the only person in 100 miles who could look at my terrible drawing and immediately see what's wrong with it. And what makes you think I'll help? Thea met his eyes. Because you've been alone for 15 years, Mr. Thornwood. And I think you're tired of it. I think you miss building things. I think you miss being useful. And I think maybe you want to help a child who's dying from preventable cold. Because you couldn't help someone else once. I don't know who. I don't need to know. But I can see it in the way you looked at Nate yesterday. Silas's face went completely still. For a moment, Thea thought she'd gone too far. Then he turned away, walked to a shelf and pulled down a rolled set of blueprints. He spread them on the table beside her drawing. They were old yellowed, covered in technical annotations. A mine shaft design, cross-sections, support structures, ventilation systems. And in the margin, in red ink, someone had written fatal flaw. Drainage insufficient. 17 years ago, Silas said quietly. I designed this shaft for the Anaconda mine in Butte. I was confident, experienced. I'd designed a dozen shafts before it. But I miscalculated the water table. Underestimated the drainage needed. The shaft flooded during construction. 3 men died. He pointed to a name written at the bottom of the blueprint. Thornwood T., assistant engineer. My son, Silas said. He was 22. He was working under me, learning the trade. He died trying to shore up the supports I'd designed wrong. The cabin was very quiet. Outside, wind moved through the pines. That's why I quit, Silas continued. That's why I came here. That's why I don't help people anymore. Because when I help people die. Thea looked at the blueprints, at the red ink marking the fatal flaw, at the name of Silas's son. Then she looked at her own crude drawing. Mr. Thornwood, she said carefully, I'm gonna dig that room whether you help me or not. I'm gonna build it with whatever knowledge I can scrape together from memory and guesswork. And I'm probably gonna make the same mistake you made. Because I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not an engineer. I'm a widow with 2 children and no money and no options. And if I build it wrong, my children will die. She rolled up her drawing. So you can help me do it right. Or you can sit here alone knowing you could have prevented it and chose not to. Either way, I'm building that room. She turned to leave. Got as far as the door. Wait. She stopped. Silas was staring at the blueprints, at his son's name. His hands were shaking slightly. If I do this, he said, you follow my instructions exactly. Every measurement, every specification. No shortcuts, no guessing. If I say stop, you stop. If I say it's unsafe, you abandon it. Agreed. Agreed. And you do the work, all of it. I'll teach you how. I'll supervise. But this is your project, your responsibility. I'm not building it for you. I understand. He nodded slowly, picked up a fresh sheet of paper. Then we start with a proper survey, soil testing, water table analysis, load calculations. We do this right, Mrs. Blackwell, or we don't do it at all. For the first time in weeks, Thea felt like she could breathe. They worked through the afternoon. Silas asked questions. Thea answered what she could. He sketched, calculated, crossed out, redrew. By the time the sun was setting, he had created a design that looked nothing like her original drawing and everything like something that might actually work. 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, 5.5 feet tall at the center, sloping slightly toward the edges for drainage. Walls built from dry stacked river stone, the stones carefully selected and placed to create thermal mass and structural integrity. A gravel floor 6 inches deep sloped toward a collection point that would drain any water seepage. Cedar posts supporting the cabin floor above spaced precisely to distribute the load. A ladder entrance narrow to conserve heat. And ventilation, 2 pipes, one for intake, one for exhaust, angled up through the foundation and disguised as drainage pipes, fitted with dampers to control airflow. This will work, Silas said, if you build it exactly as drawn. The stone walls will absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. The gravel will drain any moisture. The earth will insulate on all sides. With a small fire and body heat, you should maintain 50 to 55 degrees, even when it's 30 below outside. How long will it take to build? If you work alone, 3 months, maybe 4. I don't have 3 months. I have 6 weeks until Christmas. Silas looked at her. Then you'll need help. Will you help? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'll teach. You'll execute. And we'll see if we can do in 6 weeks what should take 12. They started the next morning. Silas came to her cabin at dawn, carrying a wooden box full of tools. Survey stakes, string lines, a plumb bob, a level, soil testing equipment that looked like it belonged in a laboratory. He climbed down into the crawl space, examined what Thea had dug, and immediately made her stop. This angle is wrong. You're digging straight down. You need to slope toward the back for drainage. And these walls are too steep. They'll collapse the moment you go deeper. You need to terrace them, step them back. He showed her how. Patiently. Precisely. The way a teacher shows a student, not the way a builder shows a laborer. Thea learned fast. She had to. Every hour mattered. Silas taught her how to read the soil, how to feel the difference between clay and loam and sand, how to test drainage by digging a small hole, filling it with water, and timing how long it took to empty, how to identify the water table by the color and moisture of the soil, how to find bedrock by sound tapping with a metal rod, and listening for the ring that meant stone beneath. She learned how to calculate load, how much weight the earth could support, how much weight the cedar posts needed to carry, how to space them so the cabin floor above wouldn't sag or crack. She learned about ventilation, how air moves in confined spaces, how carbon dioxide sinks, how moisture accumulates, how to create a system that would pull fresh air in and push stale air out without creating drafts that would steal heat. Every lesson was practical, immediate. Silas didn't explain theory unless it was necessary. He showed her what to do and why it mattered and what would happen if she did it wrong. And Thea dug. She dug in the morning before the children woke. She dug at night after they went to sleep. When Bee asked what she was doing, Thea told her the truth, building a warm place for them to sleep. Like a bear den, Bee asked. Exactly like that. By the end of the first week, the space was 4 feet deep and properly terraced. Silas pronounced the drainage acceptable. No signs of water table. Soil composition good. Bedrock at least 8 feet down, probably more. You can proceed, he said, but slowly. If you rush, you'll make mistakes. And mistakes underground kill people. By the end of the second week, the excavation was complete. 8 by 6 feet. 5.5 feet deep. The walls stepped back in careful terraces. A gravel floor installed sloped 1 inch per foot toward a drainage sump in the back corner. Thea stood in the space looking up at the rough-cut opening above her head and felt something like wonder. She was standing inside the earth, surrounded by it. And it didn't feel threatening. It felt solid, protective, almost warm. Silas climbed down beside her, checked the level, examined the walls, tested the drainage by pouring a bucket of water and watching it flow toward the sump. Good work, he said. It was the first time he'd praised anything. What's next? Stone walls. That's the hardest part. Get it wrong and the whole thing collapses. Thea had been gathering river stones for 2 weeks every afternoon when the weather allowed. Rounded granite carried down from the mountains by ancient glaciers, smoothed by centuries in the creek bed. She had hauled them back in a wheelbarrow, sorted them by size, stacked them near the cabin. Now, Silas taught her how to choose which stone went where, how to read the shape of a rock, understand its balance, know instinctively which side should face in and which should face out, how to stack them without mortar, relying on friction and gravity and geometry to hold them in place. Dry stacked stone, he said, is stronger than mortared stone if you do it right. The stones settle, lock together, become one mass. But if you choose wrong, if you stack wrong, the whole wall shifts and comes down. He showed her the first course, the foundation stones, the largest and most stable, set deep in the gravel. Then the second course, offset from the first, wedged tight. Then the third, carefully selected to bridge the gaps below. Thea watched, learned, then took over. Her hands learned before her mind did how a stone felt when it was balanced right, how it sounded when it locked into place, how to spot the small ones that would wedge into gaps and hold everything else stable. She worked slowly, sometimes spending 20 minutes choosing the right stone for a single spot. Silas never rushed her. He just watched, nodded when she got it right, made her pull it out and start over when she didn't. The walls rose, inch by inch, day by day. Be helped when she could, handing stones down through the opening, learning the names of things. Drainage sump, terrace wall, keystone. She was 8 years old, and she was learning engineering. Nate got sicker. His fever spiked again in the 3rd week. Dr. Whitmore came back, looked grim. Left more medicine that didn't help. Thea worked faster, longer hours. Her hands bled. Her back ached. She didn't care. By the 4th week, the stone walls were chest high, solid, beautiful in their rough, functional way. Silas tested them by leaning his full weight against them. They didn't move. Good, he said. Now the hard part. That wasn't the hard part. That was just walls. Now we need to make them support the ceiling. And we need ventilation. And we need to do both without compromising structural integrity. He showed her how to install the cedar posts, 6 of them 8 inches in diameter, set on flat foundation stones rising to support the cabin floor above. Each one had to be precisely vertical, precisely spaced, precisely notched at the top to accept the floor joists. Thea cut the notches by hand using a saw and chisel, working by lamplight in the cramped space underground. Silas checked each one with a level and a square. 3 times he made her redo them. She didn't complain. The ventilation was more complex. 2 pipes 4 inches in diameter made from cedar planks joined with tar and canvas. One angled up through the north foundation intake for fresh air. One through the south foundation exhaust for stale air. Both disguised on the outside as drainage pipes. Both fitted with wooden dampers that could be adjusted from inside to control airflow. Silas explained the physics. Cool air sinks, warm air rises. The intake pipe needed to be low near the floor, bringing fresh air in. The exhaust needed to be high near the ceiling, pulling stale air out. The dampers would prevent backdrafts and heat loss. Too much airflow and you'll freeze, he said. Too little and you'll suffocate. You need to find the balance. They installed the pipes, carefully sealing them with clay and tar, testing them by lighting a candle and watching the smoke move. It took 3 tries to get the angles right, but finally smoke from the candle was pulled up through the exhaust pipe and fresh air flowed in through the intake. It works, Thea said. It works now. We'll see if it works when it's 30 below. By the 5th week, the room was structurally complete. Stone walls, cedar posts, gravel floor, ventilation pipes, a ladder made from pine angled at 30 degrees, leading down from the opening in the cabin floor above, and a trapdoor insulated with packed straw and covered with cedar planks designed to seal the opening when closed. All that remained was finishing, smoothing the stone walls, installing a wooden sleeping platform, adding a small shelf for the oil lamp, making it livable. But there was a problem. Thea knelt in the back corner, checking the drainage sump as Silas had taught her, and felt water. Not much, just a few inches. But it was there, and it shouldn't have been. Silas climbed down, examined it, tested the soil around it. His face went tight. The water table's rising, probably from snowmelt upstream. It's seeping in through the gravel. Will it flood? No. The drainage should handle it, but it's going to make the space damp. And damp air feels colder than dry air. This won't be as warm as I calculated. Thea felt her heart sink. How much colder? Maybe 5 degrees, maybe more. Hard to say. 5 degrees. That could be the difference between 50 degrees and 45, between survivable and hypothermic. What do we do? Silas was quiet for a long time, staring at the water in the sump. Then he looked up at the stone walls, at the ceiling, at the space they had built together over 5 weeks of brutal work. We need a vapor barrier, something to keep moisture out of the air. And we need to improve the thermal mass. More stone, denser packing. Maybe. He stopped, frowned, looked at the corner where the water was seeping in. What if we don't fight it? He said slowly. What do you mean? The water's coming in through the gravel, which means it's flowing, which means it's warmer than the surrounding soil. Groundwater doesn't freeze. It stays liquid even when the earth around it is frozen solid, which means it's carrying heat. Thea stared at him. You want to use the water, not use it. Redirect it. Channel it along the back wall instead of into the sump. Create a heat sink. The flowing water will warm the stones. The stones will radiate heat into the space. It's counterintuitive. Exactly. They looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. This was insane. Or brilliant. Probably both. How do we do it? Silas smiled. The first time Thea had ever seen him smile. Very carefully. They spent 2 days redesigning the drainage, creating a shallow channel along the back wall lined with flat stones that would allow the water to flow slowly from one corner to the other before draining into the sump. The water would never pool, never flood, but it would move, and moving water meant heat transfer. When they finished, they tested it by pouring water into the channel and measuring the temperature of the stones after an hour. 5 degrees warmer than the stones on the opposite wall. It works, Thea said. In theory. We won't know for sure until winter really hits. By the end of the 5th week, the room was done. Thea stood in it, lamp in hand, and looked around. 8 by 6 feet. 5.5 feet tall. Stone walls dark and solid. Cedar posts holding the ceiling. wooden sleeping platform along one wall, ventilation pipes drawing air, drainage channel flowing quietly in the back, a space that smelled like earth and stone and possibility. Silas climbed down beside her, looked around, nodded. "You built this," he said. "I taught you how. But you did the work. Every stone, every measurement, every decision. This is yours." "We built it," Thea corrected. "Together." Silas didn't argue. They climbed back up into the cabin where Nate was sleeping by the fire, and Bee was reading, and Silas gathered his tools. "Test it," he said at the door. "Spend a night down there. Check the temperature, the humidity, the air quality. If anything feels wrong, don't use it. Understand?" "I understand." He nodded, started to leave, then stopped, turned back. "Mrs. Blackwell." "Thea. My son's name was Thomas. He was a good engineer, better than me probably. He saw things I missed, asked questions I didn't think to ask. He would have liked you, liked this project. He always said the best engineering was the kind that solved real problems for real people." Thea didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. Silas left. Thea closed the door, looked at her children, looked at the trapdoor in the floor. Then she went to the general store. Cornelius Webb's store was the largest building in Bitterroot Creek except for the church. 2 stories wood frame with a false front that made it look even bigger. Webb lived upstairs. The store occupied the ground floor. Dry goods, tools, fabric, medicine, flour, sugar, salt. Everything a frontier settlement needed to survive. Webb himself was 45, heavy-set, balding, with small eyes and thick fingers. He had never married. People said he loved money more than people. People were probably right. Thea found him behind the counter, tallying accounts in a leather-bound ledger. He looked up when she entered, eyes narrowing. "Mrs. Blackwell, I wasn't expecting to see you until Christmas. I need lamp oil and candles, 2 dozen. That'll be added to your account." "I know." He fetched the items, wrapped them, marked the prices in his ledger. "You're at $203 now, plus interest. I thought it was $180. It was. But you bought flour last week, and bacon the week before, and medicine 2 weeks before that. It adds up, Mrs. Blackwell." Thea felt her jaw tighten, but she didn't argue. She took the lamp oil and candles and turned to leave. "One more thing," Webb said. "I've been hearing talk around town. People say you're digging under your cabin, building something. That true?" "I'm improving my foundation. In November, odd time for it. The cold made the problem obvious." Webb smiled. Not a kind smile. "Just make sure whatever you're doing doesn't damage the property. I'd hate to take ownership of a condemned structure come Christmas." Thea met his eyes. "You'll get your money, Mr. Webb, or you'll get the property. Either way, it won't be condemned." She left before he could respond. That night, she tested the underground room for the first time. She waited until Bee was asleep. Then she bundled Nate in blankets, carried him down the ladder, and settled him on the sleeping platform. She brought the lamp, a thermometer, a cup of water to check for condensation. Then she closed the trapdoor above them. The darkness was absolute, total. The kind of darkness that makes you forget which way is up. Thea lit the lamp and the small flame pushed back the black, just enough to see the stone walls, the earthen ceiling, her son's pale face. She checked the thermometer. 48 degrees. Not quite 50, but close. Warmer than the cabin above had ever been. She sat beside Nate listening. The ventilation pipes drew air with a soft whisper. The drainage channel trickled quietly in the back. No other sound. No wind. No creaking boards. No cold seeping through the floor. Just stillness. Silence. The steady, patient warmth of the earth itself. Nate's breathing slowed, evened out. After an hour, his fever broke. For the first time in weeks, he slept without shaking. Thea watched him, felt the temperature hold steady, felt the air stay fresh despite the closed space, felt something in her chest unclench for the first time since John had died. It worked. The room worked. She stayed down there until dawn, monitoring everything. The temperature never dropped below 48. The air never grew stale. The walls never wept with condensation. Everything Silas had promised, everything they had built together, all of it functioned exactly as designed. When morning came, she carried Nate back up to the cabin. He was still weak, still sick. But he had slept through the night without coughing, without fighting for breath, without that terrible wet rattle in his lungs. Bee woke, looked at her brother, looked at her mother. Is he better? He's better. Because of the room, because of the room. Bee smiled. Then asked the question Thea had been dreading. Can I see it? Thea took her daughter's hand, led her to the trapdoor, lifted it, showed her the ladder leading down into the dark. It's not much, Thea said. Just stone and earth and wood. But it's warm. And it's ours. And it's going to keep us alive this winter. Bee climbed down, lamp in hand, and stood in the small room. She turned slowly, looking at the walls her mother had built. The ceiling held up by cedar posts, the sleeping platform where her brother had spent the night. It's perfect, she said quietly. And maybe it was. But Thea knew the real test was still coming. The room had worked for one night in November when the temperature outside was only 12 below. What would happen when December came, when January came, when the blizzards hit and the mercury dropped to 30 below and the whole world turned to ice and darkness? What would happen when winter showed its teeth? She would find out soon enough. Outside, the sky was gray with coming snow. The wind was picking up. And somewhere upstream, the storm that would test everything was already gathering strength. But for now, in this moment, Thea Blackwell stood in her cabin, with her children looking at the trapdoor in the floor, and allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to survive. The construction took over Thea's life in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the physical work, though. That was brutal enough. 2 hours before dawn, 2 hours after the children slept, sometimes 4 or 5 hours in the middle of the day, when Nate's fever allowed it, and Bea could watch him. Her hands developed calluses on top of calluses. Her shoulders ached in ways she didn't know were possible. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, but it was more than that. The room became something she thought about every waking moment. Every stone she stacked, she wondered if it would hold. Every measurement she took, she second-guessed herself. Every night when she climbed up from the crawl space and looked at her children sleeping by the fire, she asked herself the same question. What if I'm wrong? What if the walls collapse? What if the ventilation fails? What if she was just digging an expensive grave for her children instead of a shelter that would save them? Silas must have seen it in her face. Because one morning in the second week, as she was hesitating over a particularly large stone trying to decide which way it should face, he climbed down beside her and put his hand on her shoulder. "Doubt is good," he said quietly. "Doubt makes you careful. It's certainty that kills people underground." She looked at him. "You're certain this will work?" "No. I'm confident this will work if we build it right. That's different. Certainty means you stop checking. Confidence means you keep checking. But you trust the process. And if the process is wrong, then we'll know before it kills anyone. Because we're testing every step. That's what engineering is, Thea. It's not building things that can't fail. It's building things where you know how they'll fail, so you can prevent it." She placed the stone. It locked into place with a sound like bone clicking into a socket. Solid. Permanent. "How do you live with it?" she asked. "The fear that you miss something." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "You don't. You just build anyway. Because the alternative is worse." The stone walls rose steadily through the second and third weeks. Thea developed an instinct for it that surprised her. She could pick up a stone and know within seconds whether it would work in a particular spot. The weight of it, the balance, the way the rough edges would lock against the stones around it. Silas watched her work with something that might have been approval. He corrected her less and less. Sometimes he would just sit at the edge of the opening watching her stack stones in the lamplight below and nod to himself. "Your father taught you well," he said one evening. "My father taught me to listen to the earth. You taught me to build with it." Same thing, really. By the middle of the third week, the walls were waist-high and holding steady. The space was starting to feel less like a hole in the ground and more like something intentional, something designed. Thea could stand in the center and see how it would work. The sleeping platform along the east wall, the drainage channel in the back, the ladder entrance in the northwest corner, a small shelf for the lamp, maybe another for food storage. She was planning details she hadn't even thought about 2 weeks ago. Where to hang clothing so it would stay dry. How to store firewood without taking up too much floor space. whether she could fit a small stove or if body heat and a candle would be enough. It was Bee who pointed out the obvious. "Mama, where will you sleep?" Thea looked at the sleeping platform she was building. 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, barely big enough for 2 children. "I'll sleep up in the cabin. Keep the fire going." "But you'll be cold." "I'll be fine." Bee's face said she didn't believe that. But she was 8 years old, and she knew when not to argue. That night, Silas brought it up again. "She's right. You need to be down there too. Shared body heat. And someone needs to monitor the ventilation, the temperature, everything. Can't do that from upstairs. There's not enough room." "Then make more room. Extend the platform. Or build a second tier, or—" He stopped, frowned. "Actually, a second tier would work better. Heat rises. Put the children on the lower platform where it's coolest. You sleep on a raised platform above them where the warmest air pools. You'll all stay warmer that way." It made sense. Perfect sense. But it meant more work, more time, and they were already running out of both. "How long?" Thea asked. 2 days if you focus on nothing else." She focused on nothing else. Built a second platform 18 inches above the first, supported by stone corbels extending from the wall. Just wide enough for one person. Just long enough to lie down without curling up. It felt like sleeping in a shelf. But when she tested it, the temperature difference was noticeable. 3 degrees warmer than the lower platform. 3 degrees that might matter when the mercury dropped to 30 below. The third week ended with the stone walls complete. Chest high all around. Solid. Locked together so tightly that Silas couldn't wedge even a knife blade between the stones. He tested them the way he'd tested everything, with his full weight, leaning hard trying to find weakness. They held. "Good work," he said. Then after a pause, "Excellent work, actually. I've seen professional masons do worse." It was the highest praise he'd given. And Thea felt something warm in her chest that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. But there was no time to celebrate. The ceiling supports still needed to be installed. The ventilation pipes, the ladder, the trapdoor. And they had 3 weeks left until Christmas. 3 weeks until Cornelius Webb came for his money or his property. 3 weeks until she had to prove this wasn't insane. Fletcher Harding showed up on a Tuesday morning in the middle of the 4th week. He was the town's carpenter, a broad-shouldered man of 40 with thick hands and a beard that he kept trimmed shorter than most men in Bitterroot Creek. He built furniture, repaired roofs, did finish work that required precision. He was good at his job, and he knew it. He was also one of the loudest voices dismissing Thea's project as a waste of time. She was hauling river stones in the wheelbarrow when he appeared on the trail, walking toward her cabin with purpose. She set down the wheelbarrow and waited. "Mrs. Blackwell." He tipped his hat but didn't smile. "Mr. Harding, I've been hearing things about what you're building under your cabin. I imagine you have. People are saying you're digging some kind of underground room for sleeping." "That's correct." He looked at her like she'd just claimed the moon was made of cheese. That's the most foolish thing I've heard in 20 years of building. You can't sleep underground. It's not healthy. It's not safe. And it's definitely not warm. Have you ever tried it? I don't need to try it to know it's wrong. Heat rises, Mrs. Blackwell. Everyone knows that. You dig down, you're digging into cold earth. You might as well sleep in an icebox. Thea set down the stone she was holding, wiped her hands on her apron. Mr. Harding, how deep do you dig when you set a foundation post? 3 feet below the frost line. And what's the temperature of the earth at 3 feet deep? I don't know. Cold. Warmer than the air in winter. Colder than the air in summer. The earth at depth doesn't change temperature the way the surface does. It stays steady. That's basic geology. Fletcher's face reddened. I don't need geology lessons from a woman. I've been building for 20 years. Above ground. I'm building below it. Different rules. There's a reason nobody builds below ground, Mrs. Blackwell. Because it doesn't work. You're wasting your time and your money. And when you fail, don't come asking me to fix it. He turned and walked away, shoulders stiff with offense. Thea watched him go and felt a knot of doubt form in her stomach. What if he was right? What if she was fighting basic physics? What if the earth really was colder than she thought? And all this work was just... He's wrong. She turned. Silas was standing at the edge of her property, a sack of tools over his shoulder. He must have heard the whole conversation. How do you know? Because I've been in mine shafts 200 feet deep in January. And I've been warmer down there than I was on the surface. The earth doesn't lie, Thea. People do. Especially when they're defending their ignorance. He walked past her toward the cabin, and Thea followed the knot in her stomach loosening slightly. But Fletcher's visit wasn't the end of it. Word spread fast in a settlement of 60 people. By that afternoon, half the town seemed to know that Thea Blackwell was building an underground sleeping room, and that Fletcher Harding thought she was crazy. Some people just shook their heads and went about their business. But others had opinions, strong ones. Catherine Mills, the church deacon's wife, stopped by the next day with a basket of preserves and a concerned expression. She was 40 years old, thin as a fence post, with gray hair and a voice like a preacher. Thea, dear, I'm worried about you. I'm fine, Catherine. But this room you're digging, people are talking. They're saying it's not proper, not Christian. Living underground like animals. We're not living like animals. We're using the earth the way God designed it, to shelter and protect. But it's not natural. God put us above the ground, not below it. God put the earth beneath our feet. I don't think He minds if we use it. Catherine's mouth tightened. I'm just trying to help Thea. People are starting to say things about you and Mr. Thornwood. A widow and a widower spending all that time together digging beneath your home. It doesn't look right. Thea felt her temper flare. Silas is teaching me engineering. That's all. If people want to make it into something else that says more about them than it does about us, I'm just telling you what people are saying. Then tell people to mind their own business. Catherine left without the warm goodbye she'd clearly expected, and Thea stood in her doorway shaking with anger she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the gossip that bothered her. It was the assumption underneath it, that a woman couldn't learn engineering without some ulterior motive, that working with a man meant something inappropriate, that survival had to be sexualized to make sense to people. She went back to work. Anger was fuel. She used it. The ceiling supports went in during the 4th week. 6 cedar posts, 8 inches in diameter, cut to precise lengths and notched at the top to accept the floor joists above. Each one had to be exactly vertical. Even a degree or two of lean would create stress points that could fail under load. Silas showed her how to check plumb using a weighted string, how to adjust by shimming with thin pieces of wood, how to test the fit before securing it permanently. Then he stepped back and let her do it. The first post took her 4 hours. She adjusted it 17 times before Silas approved it. The second took 3 hours. The third took 2. By the 6th post, she could set it in under an hour, checking plumb twice, getting it right the first time. "You're getting good at this," Silas said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't just approval. It was recognition. One builder to another. The ventilation pipes went in next. This was the part Thea had been dreading. The physics made sense when Silas explained it, but translating theory into practice was different. She had to angle the pipes just right, seal them perfectly, install dampers that would actually work. Silas talked her through it step by step. The intake pipe comes in low near the floor. Cold air sinks, so this is where fresh air will naturally settle. Angle it up through the foundation, angled away from prevailing winds, so snow doesn't block it. They cut the pipe opening through the north foundation wall, working from inside the room. Stone dust filled the air. The sound of chisel on rock echoed in the small space. Thea's arms ached, but she kept going. Now the exhaust, high as you can get it near the ceiling. Warm air rises. This is where stale air will accumulate. We pull it out here. The south foundation wall. Same process. Cut through stone. Fit the pipe. Seal it with clay and tar. Install a wooden damper that could be adjusted from inside. When both pipes were in place, Silas lit a candle and held it near the intake. The flame flickered. Air was moving. He moved the candle to the exhaust. The flame bent sideways, pulled toward the pipe opening. Air was flowing out. "It works," Thea said. "It works now. In still air. With no temperature differential. Winter will be different. But the principle is sound." They tested it again that night after dark when the temperature had dropped. The airflow increased. Not much, but measurably. Cold air sinking through the intake. Warm air rising through the exhaust. Exactly as designed. Thea sat in the room feeling the air move across her face and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. This was working. Against all the doubters, against all her own fears, this was actually working. But the moment didn't last long, because the next morning Sheriff Amos Pritchard came calling. Pritchard was 50 years old, a former cavalry soldier with a straight back and a practical mind. He'd been sheriff of Bitterroot Creek for 8 years, and he ran things by the book. Not cruel, but not flexible either. The law was the law. He knocked on Thea's door at 9 in the morning. She answered with flour on her hands, having been making bread while Bea watched Nate. "Mrs. Blackwell, got a minute?" "Of course, Sheriff." He came inside, took off his hat, looked around the cabin like he was cataloging everything. His eyes stopped on the trapdoor in the floor, partially visible beneath the rug Thea had laid over it. "I've had a complaint," he said, "from Cornelius Webb. Says you're making unauthorized modifications to property you don't own. Says there might be building code violations." Thea felt her stomach drop. "What kind of violations?" "Underground construction without permit. Structural modifications to an existing foundation. Potential safety hazards." He pulled a paper from his coat pocket. "He's filed a formal complaint. I have to investigate. This is my home, Sheriff. I'm improving it. You're renting it technically, until you pay off the debt. Which means Webb has an interest in making sure you're not damaging his collateral." Thea wanted to argue, wanted to point out that Webb didn't give a damn about the property. He just wanted an excuse to seize it early. But arguing with the law rarely worked in a widow's favor. "Would you like to see what I'm building?" Pritchard looked surprised. "You're willing to show me I have nothing to hide." She led him to the trap door, pulled back. The rug opened it. Lamplight spilled up from below. "It's a root cellar with an emergency sleeping platform. For use during extreme cold." Pritchard looked down into the space. Thea could see him taking it in. The stone walls, the cedar posts, the gravel floor, the ventilation pipes, all of it neat, organized, clearly engineered. "That's quite a root cellar. It serves multiple purposes." "Who designed it?" "I did. With consultation from Silas Thornwood." "The mining engineer?" "Yes." Pritchard was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mind if I climb down?" "Not at all." He descended the ladder carefully, his boots loud on the rungs. Thea followed. They stood together in the small space, and Pritchard examined everything with the thorough attention of a man who'd learned to spot problems before they became disasters. He tested the stone walls, checked the ventilation pipes, examined the ceiling supports, looked at the drainage channel in the back. Finally, he looked at Thea. "This is good work. Really good work. Better than half the cabins in town." "Thank you. But it's still underground construction on property you don't technically own. Which means Webb has a legal right to object if he thinks it affects the property value. Does it? Hell, I'd say it improves it. But that's not my call to make." They climbed back up. Pritchard stood in the cabin, turning his hat in his hands, clearly thinking. "Here's what I'm going to do," he said finally. "I'm going to file a report saying I investigated the complaint and found a well-constructed root cellar with secondary emergency shelter capability. No code violations because there's no code for root cellars in Montana territory. No structural damage to the existing foundation. Property value unchanged or possibly improved." Thea felt relief flood through her. "Thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me yet. Webb's not gonna like this. He'll push back. But he'll have to take it to the territorial court, and that'll take months. By then, either you'll have paid him, or he'll have the property. Either way, this room will still be here." He put his hat back on, tipped it to her. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Blackwell, I hope it works. Lord knows we could use more people in this territory who solve problems instead of complaining about them." He left. Thea closed the door behind him and leaned against it, shaking. Webb had tried to stop her and failed, but he wouldn't give up. She knew that. He'd find another way, another angle, another legal technicality. She had 3 weeks until Christmas. 3 weeks to finish the room test it properly, and somehow find $180 she didn't have. 3 weeks to prove everyone wrong. The 4th week ended with a new problem. Nate's fever spiked again, worse than before. 104 degrees. He was delirious, calling for his father, crying that he was cold, despite being wrapped in blankets next to a roaring fire. Dr. Whitmore came, examined him, gave Thea a look that said everything. "How long?" she asked quietly out of the children's earshot. "Days. Maybe a week if you're lucky. His lungs are failing, Mrs. Blackwell. The fluid is accumulating faster than his body can clear it, and every breath in this cold air damages them further. The underground room is almost finished. Almost isn't enough. He needs to be warm now. Today. It's not safe yet. The finishing work isn't done. The insulation, He doesn't have time for safe. He has time for alive or dead. Choose." The doctor left. Thea stood alone in her cabin looking at her son and made the decision she'd been avoiding. She would move them down tonight, ready or not. Silas arrived an hour later for the daily work session and found Thea hauling blankets down through the trapdoor. He took one look at Nate, at the frantic energy in Thea's movements, and understood immediately. Is it time? It has to be. The room's not finished. No insulation on the trapdoor. The sleeping platform isn't secured properly. I know, but Nate doesn't have time to wait for perfect. Silas looked at the boy, at Thea. Then he set down his tools. Then we don't wait for perfect. We make it good enough right now, and we finish the rest from inside. They worked fast. Thea brought down bedding blankets, the oil lamp food for several days. Silas reinforced the sleeping platform, adding crossbeams he'd meant to install later. They hung a canvas curtain over the intake pipe to control drafts. Tested the dampers again. Checked the drainage. By nightfall, the room was as ready as it was gonna get. Thea carried Nate down first. He was so light it terrified her. She laid him on the lower sleeping platform, wrapped in every blanket she owned. Bee climbed down next, carrying her own small bundle of possessions. A book. A doll made from corn husks. The things that mattered to an 8-year-old. Silas stood at the top of the ladder. I'll stay up here tonight. Monitor from above. If anything goes wrong. Thank you, Thea said. It was inadequate. but it was all she had. She climbed onto her upper platform, reached up and pulled the trapdoor closed. Darkness, complete and absolute. Thea lit the lamp. The flame pushed back the black just enough to see the stone walls, the earthen ceiling, her children's faces. The temperature was 49 degrees, cold by normal standards, but warmer than the cabin above by at least 15 degrees. She lay down on the narrow platform, her body aligned with Bee and Nate below her. She could hear them breathing, could feel the warmth of the lamp rising, could smell the earth all around them, mineral and clean. And slowly over the course of the next hour, she felt the temperature stabilize, 50 degrees, then 51. The stone walls absorbing the lamp's heat, the residual warmth from the cabin above, the heat from their own bodies and holding it, storing it, radiating it back. Nate's breathing evened out. The desperate rattling gasps became something closer to normal. Not healthy, but better. Measurably better. Thea lay in the dark listening to her son breathe and felt tears slide down her face. It was working. They lived underground for the next 2 days, while Silas worked above and below, finishing what could be finished while they occupied the space. It was strange, disorienting. The darkness was absolute when the lamp wasn't lit. Time became meaningless. Thea woke and slept according to her children's needs, not the sun's schedule. But Nate got stronger. Hour by hour, day by day. His fever broke completely on the second day. His breathing cleared. He asked for food, which he hadn't done in weeks. Wanted to know where they were, why it was dark, why everything smelled like dirt. Bee explained it to him in her matter-of-fact 8-year-old way. We're underground, like bears. Mama built a den to keep us warm. Nate accepted this with the easy logic of a 5-year-old. Are we bears now? We're people who are warm. That's better than bears. Thea taught them both how to read the thermometer, how to adjust the ventilation dampers, how to bank the small fire she'd installed in a clay pot, just enough heat to warm stones without smoking them out, how to listen to the air moving through the pipes. They were learning to live in the earth, and the earth was teaching them how to survive. On the 3rd day, Silas completed the trapdoor insulation, packed straw between 2 layers of cedar planks sealed with canvas and tar. When closed, it formed an airtight seal that held the heat in and the cold out. With the door properly sealed, the temperature in the room rose to 53 degrees. Comfortable, survivable, proof. Thea climbed up to the cabin for the first time in 3 days. The contrast shocked her. The cabin felt like an icebox. Frost on the windows, ice in the water bucket. The fire in the hearth seemed to produce no heat at all, just light and smoke. How had they survived even this long? Silas was working on something at the table. Plans, drawings. She looked over his shoulder and saw calculations for a ventilation improvement. He was still trying to make it better. The room works, she said. It works adequately. I think we can get another 2 or 3 degrees if we adjust the exhaust pipe angle. Silas, it works. Nate is getting better. That's enough. He set down his pencil, looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since this whole project started. You did this, he said quietly. I gave you some engineering principles, but you built it. You made the decisions. You solved the problems. This is your achievement, Thea. We did it together. No, I taught. You built. There's a difference. They were both quiet for a moment. Then Silas said, I owe you an apology. For what? For the last 15 years. For wasting them. After my son died, I convinced myself that building things was dangerous, that my knowledge was poison, that I should hide away and never touch another project as long as I lived. He gestured toward the trap door. But watching you build that room, watching you learn and adapt and solve problems I didn't even see coming, I realized something. Thomas didn't die because I taught him engineering. He died because I made a mistake. And the answer to that isn't to stop teaching. It's to teach better. To pass on what I learned from the mistake so nobody else makes it. You did teach better. You taught me. And you built something that's going to save lives, not just your children's. When people see this work, they're going to copy it, improve it, build their own versions. This room is going to ripple outward, Thea, because you had the courage to dig when everyone else said it was impossible. Thea didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. They worked together for another week. Small improvements, adjustments. Thea discovered that one corner stayed slightly colder than the others. A thermal bridge where heat was conducting away through a pocket of denser soil. She studied it for 2 days trying to figure out the solution. Silas suggested adding more insulation. Thea didn't think that would work. The problem wasn't heat escaping, it was heat not reaching that corner in the first place. On the 3rd day, staring at the stone walls, she had an idea. What if we used the thermal bridge instead of fighting it? Silas looked at her. Explain. Heat is conducting a way through that soil, which means the soil is connected to something cooler. Probably a rock layer that extends outside the room. What if we place stones right at the bridge point? Let them absorb the heat that's trying to escape. Then they'll warm up and radiate it into the cold corner. Silas stared at her. That's... He stopped, recalculated in his head. That's brilliant. You're not insulating against the loss. You're redirecting the flow, creating a thermal battery at the exact point where the heat is being pulled away. Will it work? I don't know. But it's exactly the kind of thinking that separates competent engineers from exceptional ones. Let's try it. They placed 3 large, flat stones at the thermal bridge point, angled to catch the maximum heat flow. Within 6 hours, the stones were noticeably warm. Within 12, the cold corner had equalized with the rest of the room. 52 degrees all around. You just solved a problem I've been thinking about for 20 years, Silas said. How to manage thermal bridges in underground construction without adding expensive insulation. The answer was right there. Use them. Don't fight them. Thea smiled. My father used to say the earth doesn't fight you. It just is. Your father was smarter than most engineers I've known. By the 5th week, the room was finished. Truly finished. Every detail complete. Every system tested and proven. Thea and the children had been living in it for 2 weeks straight, only coming up to the cabin for cooking and supplies. The temperature held steady between 52 and 54 degrees, regardless of conditions outside. The ventilation kept the air fresh without creating drafts. The drainage handled moisture perfectly. The sleeping platforms were comfortable. The space felt less like a hole in the ground and more like a proper room. Safe, intentional. Home. Nate had recovered completely. His cough was gone. His color had returned. He played with Bee on the gravel floor building things with stones telling stories about bears and dens and underground kingdoms. Bee had taken to the space like she was born for it. She monitored the temperature, obsessively adjusting dampers, checking for condensation, reporting any changes to her mother. She understood how the room worked better than most adults would. When I grow up, she told Thea one night, I want to build things like this. Underground things. Buildings that work with the earth instead of just sitting on top of it. Then you'll need to study mathematics, engineering, physics. Will you teach me? I'll teach you what I know. The rest you'll have to learn from books and from people who know more than me. Like Mr. Thornwood. Like Mr. Thornwood. The week before Christmas, the first major storm warnings came through. Travelers from the north reported massive snow accumulation in the mountains, temperatures dropping to dangerous levels. A blizzard building that looked worse than anything in recent memory. Expected arrival. December 24th, Christmas Eve. The same day Cornelius Webb's deadline expired. Thea stood in her cabin looking out the window at the gray sky and knew the real test was coming, not just of the room, of everything. Silas came by that evening carrying a bundle wrapped in canvas. He set it on the table and unwrapped it. Inside were emergency supplies, candles, matches, dried food, a medical kit. For the storm, he said, you'll want to be underground when it hits. Could last several days. I know. And Webb will probably try to come for his payment during it. Or right after. When you're most vulnerable. I know that too. Do you have the money? Thea shook her head. I have $43 from selling eggs and sewing work. It's not enough. It's not even close. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, I could loan you the rest. No. Thea. No, I won't take your money, Silas. You've given enough. More than enough. If Webb takes the property, so be it. But the room stays. And my children stay alive. That's what matters. Where will you go? I don't know. Somewhere. We'll figure it out. She said it with more confidence than she felt. But what else could she do? She'd built the room, proven it worked, saved her children from freezing to death. Those were victories even if she lost everything else. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right. But when the storm comes, you're not alone. I'll be here, checking on you, making sure the room holds up, making sure you're all safe. You don't have to do that. I know, but I'm going to anyway. The storm arrived on schedule. Christmas Eve, just after noon. It started as light snow, pretty and seasonal. Within 2 hours, the wind had picked up to 30 miles per hour. Within 4, visibility dropped to nothing. Within 6, the temperature fell to 10 below zero. And it kept falling. Thea moved the children underground at sunset. They carried everything they'd need for a week. Food, water, extra blankets, books, Bee's doll, Nate's carved wooden horse, the oil lamp, candles, every necessity and small comfort. Silas helped them settle in, then climb back up to monitor from the cabin above. He'd stay there tending a small fire, just to keep the chimney from icing over. Checking on them every few hours, Thea closed the trap door, sealed them in, lit the lamp, and waited for winter to show what it could really do. The storm lasted 6 days. 6 days of howling wind and driving snow and temperatures that dropped to 28 below zero. The coldest anyone in Bitterroot Creek could remember. The kind of cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. That froze metal so cold it burned to touch. That killed exposed skin in minutes. Above ground it was a nightmare. Cabins creaked and groaned under the weight of snow. Chimneys clogged with ice. Firewood ran out. People burned furniture, fence posts, anything that would catch. Some cabins lost their fires entirely and became iceboxes with the people inside. But underground in the small room Thea had built it was 52 degrees. Every hour, every day, constant as the earth itself. They lived quietly, told stories, read books, slept when they were tired, ate simple meals of dried meat and hardtack. Bee practiced her numbers. Nate played with his toy horse. Thea monitored the systems obsessively, but there was nothing to fix. Everything worked exactly as designed. On the 3rd day, Silas came down with news. Fletcher Harding's chimney had clogged. His family was choking on smoke. The cabin was too cold to stay in, but the storm was too dangerous to leave. "He's asking for help," Silas said. Thea looked at her children, at the small safe space she'd created, at the man who'd told her she was wasting her time. "Tell him to bring his family here." Silas looked surprised. "You're sure?" "We have room, and whatever Fletcher said about me, I won't let his children freeze." 20 minutes later, Fletcher Harding appeared at the trapdoor, snow-covered and shaking. Behind him, his wife Sarah and their 3 children, all of them half frozen and scared. Thea helped them down the ladder. They crowded into the small space, 8 people now instead of 3. It was tight, cramped, but it was warm. Fletcher stood in the center of the room looking around at the stone walls. The sleeping platforms, the ventilation pipes, the lamp burning steady. His face worked through several emotions: shock, shame, gratitude, awe. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said finally, "I was wrong. I was a fool. And you just saved my children's lives." Thea met his eyes. The earth doesn't hold grudges, Mr. Harding. Neither do I. Fletcher Harding's family changed everything. Not just because they were their 8 people now, instead of 3 in a space designed for maybe 4. Not just because Fletcher had to sit in the corner and confront the fact that his pride had nearly killed his children, while the woman he'd mocked saved them. Though both those things mattered, it changed everything because people noticed. On the 4th day of the storm, when the temperature outside hit 30 below, and half the cabins in Bitterroot Creek were running out of firewood when children were crying from cold that no amount of blankets could stop, when grown men were looking at their families and realizing they might not make it through the week, someone noticed that smoke was still rising from Fletcher Harding's chimney, except it wasn't his chimney. It was Thea Blackwell's cabin. And when James Finch Fletcher's neighbor fought his way through waist-deep snow to check on them, he found Fletcher's cabin empty and dark and cold as a tomb. He made it to Thea's cabin, pounded on the door until Silas opened it. "Where's Fletcher? Where's his family?" Silas pointed down. "Underground. With Mrs. Blackwell. Underground. She built a room under the cabin floor. They're warm down there." James stared at him like he'd spoken in tongues. Warm in a hole in the ground. In this cold. Warmer than up here. 52 degrees last I checked. James Finch had 2 children and a wife. His cabin was 23 degrees inside despite burning furniture. His youngest daughter had stopped shivering 2 hours ago, which he knew was a bad sign. A very bad sign. "Can we—" He stopped. Started again. "Would Mrs. Blackwell? She'd let you in. But you'd better move fast." An hour later, the Finch family came down the ladder. 4 more people. 12 total now in a space that was starting to feel very small. Thea organized them like a general organizing troops. The children on the lower sleeping platform, bodies pressed together for shared warmth. The adults on the floor, backs against the stone walls. Sarah Harding and Martha Finch on the upper platform, with Thea the warmest spot reserved for those who needed to stay alert, who needed to monitor conditions. The room temperature dropped to 49 degrees with the increased load. Not ideal, but still survivable. Still warmer than anywhere else in Bitterroot Creek. Thea showed them how the ventilation worked. How to adjust the dampers if the air felt stale. How to check the drainage. How to bank the small clay pot fire to produce heat without smoke. How to live in the earth instead of on top of it. Fletcher watched her teach, and the shame on his face was painful to see. But he listened, learned. When his youngest started to cry from claustrophobia from the darkness and the strange smells and the press of bodies, Fletcher was the one who calmed her, told her about bears in dens, about how the smartest animals know that sometimes down is better than up. On the 5th day, 2 more families arrived. The Cortlands, who lived a quarter-mile upstream. Their chimney had caught fire, nearly burned their cabin down. They'd managed to put it out, but now had no heat source at all. And the Bakers, an elderly couple whose cabin had accumulated so much snow on the roof that it was starting to sag. They were afraid it would collapse. 17 people total. The room was packed, shoulder to shoulder. No privacy, barely enough space to move. But it was warm, and no one was dying. Thea had to make hard decisions, ration the lamp oil more strictly. 1 lamp instead of 2. Fewer hours of light, more time in darkness. She calculated food supplies and realized they had maybe 3 days left at current consumption. Water was less of a problem. They could melt snow, but carrying it up and down the ladder with this many people was becoming dangerous. She established rules, quiet hours so people could sleep, designated times for using the ladder, a rotation for monitoring the ventilation. Everyone had a job, even the children. Nate was in charge of checking the thermometer every hour. B monitored the drainage sump. The older children helped distribute food. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos. And in the center of it all, Thea Blackwell, 32 years old, widow mother builder, kept everything running through sheer force of competence. Fletcher pulled her aside on the evening of the 5th day. "You should be charging us for saving our lives. With what, everyone's in the same situation. No one has money right now. When the storm ends then, when we can work again. When the storm ends, you can help me teach others how to build their own rooms. That's payment enough." He nodded slowly. "You're a better person than I am, Mrs. Blackwell. I'm just doing what needs doing. Same as you would if you had the knowledge. I had the knowledge to build above ground. Never thought to look down. Now you know. Teach others." It was 2 in the morning on the 6th day when disaster struck. Thea was on the upper platform, half asleep when she heard it. A sound like a sigh, like the earth itself exhaling. She was awake instantly, lamp in hand, looking for the source. There, the northeast corner. The stone wall was moving. Not much, just a fraction of an inch. But in underground construction, a fraction of an inch was the difference between stable and catastrophic. She climbed down carefully, trying not to wake the others. Pressed her hand against the wall. Felt it shift slightly under pressure. Her heart started pounding. Frost heave. It had to be. The ground outside was frozen solid now, expanding, pushing against the foundation. She'd accounted for this in the design, or thought she had. But with this many people, this much body heat, the thermal gradient between inside and outside was more extreme than she'd calculated. The frost was pushing harder than expected. If the wall failed, the ceiling could collapse. 17 people buried alive. She needed Silas. But Silas was up in the cabin, probably asleep. And waking him meant opening the trap door, letting heat escape, disturbing everyone. No. She could handle this. She had to handle this. Thea studied the wall in the lamplight. The stones were shifting because they were being pushed from outside. She couldn't stop the push, but she could reinforce from inside, create a counter-pressure. Buttress the wall so it couldn't move any further. She looked around the room. What did she have? Cedar posts supporting the ceiling, but she couldn't move those. The sleeping platforms, but pulling them apart would wake everyone and create panic. The firewood stack, but the pieces were too short. Wait. The ladder. It was 8 feet of solid pine, 2 by 8 inches, designed to carry weight. If she could wedge it against the shifting wall at an angle, brace it against the opposite wall, it would create a diagonal support, a temporary buttress. But she'd need to calculate the angle exactly. Too steep and it wouldn't hold. Too shallow and it wouldn't provide enough counter pressure. And she'd need to do it in the dark quietly, without disturbing 17 sleeping people. Thea closed her eyes, visualized the geometry. The wall was 8 feet long. The room was 6 feet wide. If she placed the base of the ladder against the opposite wall 2 feet from the floor, and the top against the shifting wall 4 feet from the floor, that would create a 45-degree angle. No, wait. She needed more. 60 degrees. Which meant she did the math in her head. Numbers her father had taught her. Trigonometry. Load calculations. The kind of engineering that looked like magic but was really just careful thinking. She needed the base 3 feet from the floor, top at 5 feet. That would create the right angle. But she'd need something to keep the base from slipping. The stone floor was too smooth. She looked at her boots, heavy leather, grippy soles. If she wedged them under the base of the ladder, they'd provide friction. Not perfect, but maybe enough. Thea moved carefully, lifted the ladder from its brackets, trying not to scrape it against stone. 17 people sleeping, some of them light sleepers, all of them on edge from days underground. She positioned the base against the west wall, removed her boots, wedged them underneath, lifted the top of the ladder and pressed it against the northeast corner where the stones were shifting. The ladder bowed slightly under the compression. She'd calculated right. It was bearing load, creating counter pressure against the frost heave outside. She held it there, muscles straining for a full minute, testing, feeling for movement. The wall stopped shifting. The stones locked back into place, held by the diagonal pressure of the ladder. Slowly, carefully, Thea released her grip. The ladder held. The wall held. She stood there in her sock feet, breathing hard, and felt a hand on her shoulder. Silas. He must have heard something come down to check. He looked at the ladder, at the wall, at Thea. His expression in the lamplight was unreadable. Frost heave, he whispered. Yes. How bad? Bad enough. The wall was starting to shift. I buttressed it. He examined her work, checked the angle, tested the pressure, looked at her boots wedged under the base. This is exactly what I would have done, he said quietly. Exactly. Down to the angle. You didn't need me at all, did you? I learned from you. No. You learned from your father. I just reminded you what you already knew. He pressed his hand against the wall. This'll hold until the storm ends. After that, we'll need to add permanent reinforcement. But for now, it's perfect. I was terrified I'd calculated wrong. You didn't. Trust yourself, Thea. You're better at this than you think. They stood together in the darkness, listening to 17 people breathe. And Thea felt something settle in her chest. She could do this, not just with help, not just under supervision. She could engineer solutions on her own in the dark under pressure and get them right. The storm broke on the morning of the 7th day. The wind stopped first. That was how you knew. The howling that had been constant for nearly a week just ceased, like someone had closed a door. Then the snow stopped. Then slowly, the temperature started to rise. Not much, from 30 below to 20 below. But it was movement in the right direction. Silas opened the trap door for the first time in 18 hours. Light poured down, weak winter sunlight, but after so long in lamplight it was blinding. People started to emerge, stiff, sore, blinking like cave creatures. They climbed the ladder one at a time, helped each other up, stood in the cabin and looked around, like they'd forgotten what above ground looked like. Thea came up last, carrying Nate. Bee climbed behind her. They stood in the cabin doorway and looked out at Bitterroot Creek. The world had been transformed. Snow 4 feet deep in places. Drifts up to the roof lines. Trees bent under the weight. 2 cabins had collapsed completely. 3 others had lost their roofs. Smoke rose from maybe half the chimneys in town. But people were moving, digging out, checking on neighbors, already starting the work of survival. Fletcher stood beside Thea, looking at his own cabin across the way. The roof had held but barely. Snow was piled 6 feet high against the north wall. "I don't know what to say to you, Mrs. Blackwell. You don't have to say anything. My family would be dead if not for you. We all would. The earth saved you. I just showed you how to use it." He shook his head. "No. You saved us. You built this. You opened your door when you didn't have to. You shared your space, and your food, and your knowledge. That's not the earth, Mrs. Blackwell. That's you." Thea didn't know how to respond to that, so she just nodded. People left slowly over the next hour, back to their own cabins to assess damage salvage, what they could start rebuilding. Each family thanked Thea, some with words, some with looks. The elderly Bakers pressed a silver dollar into her hand, tears on their weathered faces. "It's all we have," Mrs. Baker said, "but it's yours." Thea tried to give it back. They refused. She pocketed it, knowing she'd find a way to return it later. By noon, only Thea's family and Silas remained. They stood together in the cabin, looking at the trap door, and Thea felt the weight of what had just happened settling on her shoulders. 17 people, 6 days, 0 casualties. "They're going to want their own rooms now," Silas said. "You know that, right? Every family that was down there, they felt what it was like. 50 degrees when it's 30 below outside. They're going to want that for themselves." "Good. They should have it. You'll need to teach them. Show them how to build. We'll teach them. Together." Silas smiled. Together. There was a knock at the door. Thea opened it to find Sheriff Pritchard, snow-covered and grim-faced. "Mrs. Blackwell, glad to see you made it through." "We did. Everyone who came here did. I heard. Word spreads fast in a small town." He paused. I need to tell you something. We lost 3 people in the storm. Old Samuel Morrison lived alone up on the ridge, found frozen in his cabin. The Hendricks's baby pneumonia. And he stopped, looked uncomfortable. And who? Thea asked, though she already knew. Cornelius Webb. His store roof collapsed under the snow load. He was inside trying to protect his inventory. They found him this morning. Thea felt the words hit her like a physical blow. Webb was dead. The man who'd held her debt, who'd threatened to take her home, who'd tried to shut down her construction. Dead. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, and meant it. Whatever else Webb had been, he didn't deserve to die alone under a collapsed roof. "There's more," Pritchard said. "Webb died intestate. No will, no heirs. His property reverts to the territory, which means your debt." He paused. "Your debt dies with him, Mrs. Blackwell. The cabin is yours, free and clear." Thea stood very still, trying to process what she was hearing. The cabin was hers. The debt was gone. She didn't have to pay, didn't have to leave, didn't have to watch her children lose their home. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Completely. Territorial law is clear on this. No heir, no debt transfer. You're free of it." After Pritchard left, Thea sat down at her table and put her head in her hands. Not crying, just overwhelmed. By relief. By guilt at feeling relief over a man's death. By the sheer weight of everything that had happened in the last 6 weeks. Silas sat across from her, said nothing, just sat there present and steady. Finally, Thea looked up. "I need to do something." "What?" "I need to help the families who lost their homes, the ones whose roofs collapsed. They have nowhere to go. You just housed 17 people for a week. You've done enough. It's not about enough. It's about what's needed." She stood up, pulled on her coat. "Come on, we have work to do." They spent the next week helping rebuild. Thea worked alongside Fletcher, who'd apparently decided to devote himself to making amends. They cleared snow from collapsed roofs, salvaged timber, helped families salvage what could be salvaged from damaged cabins. And everywhere she went, people asked about the underground room. How had she built it? How deep? What materials? How did the ventilation work? Could it really stay that warm in any weather? Thea answered every question, drew diagrams in the snow, explained the principles her father had taught her, showed them how to read soil, calculate drainage, stack stone without mortar. By the end of January, 3 families had started digging their own rooms. Fletcher Harding was building one under his cabin, following Thea's design almost exactly. James Finch was modifying his root cellar, adding sleeping platforms and proper ventilation. The Cortlands were digging a new space from scratch larger than Thea's design for their family of 5. Silas and Thea became traveling consultants. They'd visit a dig site, check the work, offer corrections and advice. Silas handled the technical explanations. Thea handled the practical demonstrations. They worked well together, 2 teachers with different strengths, helping a community learn to build in a way they'd never imagined before. Spring came slowly to Montana. The snow didn't really melt until April, but when it did, when the ground thawed and the creeks ran high and the world turned from white to brown to green, Bitterroot Creek looked different. 12 families had built underground rooms. Some were simple, just sleeping spaces for cold nights. Others were elaborate with multiple chambers, storage areas, even small workshops. The designs varied, but the principle was the same. Work with the earth. Let it hold your heat. Stay below the wind. Thea opened a formal workshop in May. Not for profit, just for teaching. Every Saturday morning, anyone who wanted to learn about underground construction could come to her cabin. She'd teach the basics: soil analysis, drainage, ventilation, structural support, the engineering principles that made the difference between a safe shelter and a death trap. Fletcher Harding came every week. So did James Finch. So did a dozen others, even some women, which raised eyebrows. But Thea didn't care. If you wanted to learn, you were welcome. Gender didn't matter. Only willingness to work. Bea sat in on every session, taking notes in a ledger book Silas had given her. She was 9 years old now, and she understood load calculations better than some of the grown men in the class. She'd ask questions that made Thea think. That made Silas smile. Questions like, what if you built 2 levels instead of 1? And could you use earth sheltering for a barn? And why don't we build everything this way? Good questions. Questions that had answers but required thinking to find them. In June, a territorial inspector came through Bitterroot Creek. He'd heard about the underground construction boom and wanted to see if it violated any codes or safety regulations. Thea showed him everything. Her original room, the modifications in Fletcher's cabin, the new designs other families were trying. He spent 3 days examining structures, checking ventilation, testing drainage. At the end, he filed a report that read, "No violations found. Construction quality exceeds territorial standards for above-ground housing. Recommend adoption of earth-sheltered emergency spaces in all cold-weather settlements." The report made its way to Helena, then to other territorial offices. Within a year, Montana Territory officially recognized earth-sheltered emergency rooms as acceptable construction. Within 2 years, it was being taught in the Territorial Engineering Manual. All because a widow had refused to watch her children freeze. In the fall of 1888, Thea received her first commission. A rancher 30 miles north wanted an earth-sheltered bunkhouse for his hands, something that would stay warm in winter without burning a fortune in firewood. Could she design it? She could. She did. With Silas's help, she drew up plans for a semi-underground structure, the north wall fully buried, the south wall exposed for light and ventilation, sleeping quarters for 8, a small common area, proper drainage and airflow. They built it in 6 weeks. The rancher paid her $50, more money than Thea had seen since John died. She used half to buy books, engineering texts, geology manuals, mathematics primers, for herself and for Bea, who devoured them like novels. Word spread. By 1889, Thea had designed 7 earth-sheltered structures across western Montana. Houses, bunkhouses, storage facilities, a schoolhouse in a settlement that couldn't afford to heat a traditional building. She wasn't rich, but she wasn't starving either. And more importantly, she was doing work that mattered, work that saved lives, work that changed how people thought about shelter in the harshest environment on the continent. Fletcher Harding, who'd once mocked her, became her biggest advocate. He told everyone who'd listen about how Thea Blackwell had saved his family, how she'd opened her home when she didn't have to, how she'd shared knowledge when she could have kept it secret and profited from it. That woman has more integrity in her little finger than most men have in their whole bodies, he'd say. And she's a better engineer than anyone I've ever met. Coming from Fletcher, who'd spent 20 years building above ground, that meant something. In the spring of 1890, Thea was approached by the territorial government. They wanted her to consult on emergency shelter designs for remote settlements, places where harsh winters killed people every year. Could she help? She could. She traveled with Silas to 6 different settlements that summer, taught local builders how to construct earth-sheltered spaces, how to read soil, how to calculate thermal mass, how to build for survival instead of just appearance. Bea came with them, 11 years old now, carrying her own notebook, asking questions, learning not just from her mother, but from every builder they met. She was becoming an engineer before anyone's eyes, including her own. Nate, 8 years old, preferred to stay home. He was more interested in animals than buildings, but he understood what his mother had done for him. Understood that he was alive because she'd refused to accept that cold was just something you endured. In 1891, Thea received official recognition from Montana Territory, a certificate signed by the governor commending her innovative approach to cold weather shelter design and her service to communities across the territory. She hung it on her cabin wall next to a drawing Bea had made of the original underground room, the room where it all started, the room that had saved 17 people and changed everything. Silas was there for the presentation, proud as any father. "You did this," he said. "All of it. I just gave you some equations. You gave me more than that. You gave me confidence when I had none. You trusted me to build when everyone else said I'd fail, because you were going to build anyway, with or without me. I just helped you do it right." They stood together looking at the certificate, and Thea thought about everything that had changed since that desperate night when she'd first lifted the floorboards and started digging. She'd lost a husband, gained a teacher, lost a debt, gained a profession, nearly lost a son, saved him and 16 others in the process. And somewhere in the middle of all that, she'd stopped being just Dorothea Blackwell, widow and mother. She'd become Thea Blackwell, engineer, teacher, builder of things that mattered. The years passed. In 1893, Thea designed and oversaw construction of the Bitterroot Creek Community Emergency Shelter, a large earth-sheltered building capable of housing 200 people during extreme weather events. It cost $4,000 to build. The territory funded half. The local community raised the rest. It stood as a monument to what happens when one person's desperate innovation becomes a community's shared knowledge. In 1895, B. Blackwell, 16 years old, applied to the Montana School of Mines in Butte. She was the only woman in her class. She graduated 4 years later with honors in civil engineering. Her thesis, Principles of Thermal Management in Earth-Sheltered Architecture Lessons from Bitterroot Creek. She dedicated it to her mother. In 1903, B received her professional engineering license, the first woman in Montana to do so. She immediately went to work designing earth-sheltered buildings across the western states. Schools, libraries, emergency shelters, buildings that worked with the land instead of fighting it. Reporters asked her where she learned to think this way. She always gave the same answer. My mother taught me that the best solutions are often the ones nobody's looking at. Everyone builds up. She built down. That one choice changed everything. In 1908, Thea, at 53, was still consulting on projects, still teaching workshops, still traveling to remote settlements to show builders how to work with the earth, instead of just on top of it. Her hair had gone gray. Her hands were permanently stained with soil and stone dust, but she was healthy, active, engaged. Silas, 83, now had slowed down considerably. He still advised on projects when his health permitted, but mostly he sat in his cabin and wrote. Technical manuals, engineering guides, documentation of everything he and Thea had learned over 2 decades of building underground. Someone needs to write this down properly, he told her. So when we're gone, the knowledge isn't. He finished his comprehensive guide to earth-sheltered construction in 1914, published it through a technical press in Denver, dedicated it to Thomas Thornwood, his son, and to Thea Blackwell, who reminded him why engineering mattered. The book became standard reference material for cold weather construction across the Northern Territories. In 1918, Silas Thornwood died quietly in his sleep at 89. Thea found him the next morning. He'd been writing in his journal, documenting a new ventilation design he'd been thinking about. The pencil was still in his hand. She cried for him, for the man who'd taken his guilt and turned it into teaching, who'd spent the last 30 years of his life making sure his son's death meant something, who'd trusted a desperate widow with knowledge that had saved hundreds of lives. They buried him next to his wife in the small cemetery overlooking Bitterroot Creek. The whole settlement attended. Fletcher gave the eulogy, talked about how Silas had taught them all to build better, to think deeper, to question assumptions. B placed a stone from the original underground room on his grave, one of the foundation stones, solid, permanent, holding weight. Nate Blackwell, 33 years old, a veterinarian with a practice in Missoula, came home to visit his mother. He found her in her workshop teaching a class of 15 people how to calculate load distribution for underground ceiling supports. You're 70 years old, Ma. When are you going to retire? When people stop needing to learn how to not freeze to death. So probably never. He laughed. But he was proud of her. Everyone was. In 1921, there was a dedication ceremony for the new Blackwell Community Center in Helena, a large earth-sheltered building designed by B. Blackwell, funded by state grants and private donations. It housed a library, a meeting hall, and emergency shelter space for 500 people. Thea, 66 years old, stood at the podium and looked out at 200 faces. Half of them were people she'd taught over the years. The other half were their students. "I'm not a speech maker," she said. "I'm a builder. But I'll tell you what I learned 34 years ago when I was digging under my cabin floor, scared to death. I was going to kill my children instead of save them." She paused, looked at B standing in the front row, at Nate beside her, at Fletcher Harding, white-haired now but still strong, at all the people who'd learned from her over the decades. "I learned that the earth doesn't fight us. We fight it because we think we're supposed to. Because everyone else does. Because that's how it's always been done. But the earth doesn't care about tradition. It doesn't care about what's proper or expected or normal. It just is what it is. Steady. Reliable. Patient. When you work with it instead of against it, when you listen to what it's telling you, instead of imposing your assumptions on it, amazing things become possible. Not miracles, not magic. Just good engineering based on understanding what's really there. I didn't invent anything. I just remembered what my father taught me and applied it to a problem everyone said was unsolvable. And that one choice, that one moment of looking down instead of up, rippled outward in ways I never imagined. So if there's a lesson here, it's this: don't accept that something can't be done just because nobody's done it yet. Don't let other people's assumptions become your limitations. And don't be afraid to dig deeper, literally or figuratively, when the obvious answers aren't working. The earth holds its secrets close, but it shares them with anyone willing to listen. She stepped away from the podium. The applause was thunderous. Afterward, a young man approached her, maybe 20 years old, fresh-faced and earnest. "Mrs. Blackwell, I'm studying engineering at the university. I read your daughter's thesis and Mr. Thornwood's book. I just wanted to say your work changed how I think about architecture, about problem solving, about everything." Thea smiled. "Then pass it on. Teach others. That's how knowledge stays alive." "I will, I promise." She watched him walk away and thought about the underground room beneath her cabin. Still there. Still functional after 34 years. The stones still holding. The ventilation still drawing air. The drainage still working exactly as designed. Sometimes Nate used it when he visited. Said it was the best sleep he got anywhere. Quiet. Dark. Perfectly temperature controlled. Like sleeping in the earth's embrace. Thea had built other things since then. Dozens of projects across 3 states. But that first room would always be the most important. Not because it was the most sophisticated or the largest or the most impressive. Because it was the one built out of pure desperation and love. The one that proved impossible things become possible when you refuse to accept that children should freeze. In 1924, the Montana Historical Society interviewed Thea for their oral history project. She sat in her cabin, 69 years old, hands still strong enough to stack stone, mind still sharp enough to calculate loads in her head, and told them the story, the whole story. From the first frozen morning when Nate couldn't breathe to the moment she pried up those floorboards, to the night 17 people survived the worst storm in 40 years because a widow had refused to give up. The interviewer asked, "Do you consider yourself a pioneer?" Thea thought about that. "No, I consider myself a mother who got desperate enough to try something everybody said wouldn't work. The fact that it did, the fact that it changed things, that's just what happens when you solve a real problem with a real solution. People notice, people learn, people build on it. And the fact that you were a woman doing engineering work in the 1880s didn't seem relevant at the time. Still doesn't. Earth doesn't care about gender. Neither does cold. Neither should engineering. What do you want people to remember?" Thea looked out her window. Across the valley, she could count 15 earth-sheltered buildings from where she sat. Houses, barns, storage facilities. All of them built using principles she'd helped establish. All of them keeping people warm, safe, alive. "I want them to remember that the best answers are often the ones we're not looking at. That tradition isn't always right. That one person with a good idea and the courage to execute it can change how everyone else thinks about a problem. And I want them to remember Silas Thornwood, the man who took his worst failure and turned it into teaching, who trusted me when I had no credentials, no experience, nothing but desperation and my father's half-remembered lessons. Without Silas, none of this happens." The interviewer made notes, asked a few more questions, thanked her, and left. Thea sat alone in her cabin, listening to the wind outside, and thought about going down to the room that started everything, the stones she'd stacked with bleeding hands, the ventilation pipe she'd installed while her son fought for breath, the space that had saved 17 lives and launched a movement. She climbed down the ladder. Her joints ached more than they used to, but she managed. Stood in the room, lamp in hand, and looked around. It hadn't changed. Still 8 by 6 feet. Still stone walls and cedar posts and that reliable 52-degree warmth. Still the most important thing she'd ever built. She sat on the lower sleeping platform where Nate and Bee used to sleep. Ran her hand over the stone wall. Felt the coolness of it. The solidness. "We did it," she said, quietly. Not to anyone in particular. Maybe to Silas. Maybe to her father. Maybe to John. Maybe just to the earth itself. We did it. Above ground, the world went on. Bee was in Seattle designing an earth-sheltered school. Nate was in Missoula tending animals and raising his own children. The settlement of Bitterroot Creek had grown to 200 people. The underground shelters had become so common that nobody thought them strange anymore. But down here, 5 feet beneath the surface, everything was exactly as it had been in 1887. Quiet, still, protected. Thea climbed back up, closed the trap door, made tea, sat at her table with Silas's engineering manual open in front of her, reviewing designs for a new project in Spokane. 69 years old, still working, still teaching, still showing people that the earth holds answers if you're willing to dig for them. Outside, snow began to fall. The first snow of the season. Not heavy yet, but it would be. Winter always came back to Montana. Every year. Reliable as the earth itself. But Thea Blackwell wasn't afraid of winter anymore. She'd learned its secrets. Learned how to work with it instead of against it. Learned that sometimes the warmest place is down instead of up. And in learning that, she'd taught hundreds of others. A knowledge that would ripple forward through generations, through Bee's buildings, through the engineers Bee would teach, through everyone who'd ever spent a winter night in an earth-sheltered space and wondered who first thought to build this way. The answer was always the same. A widow in Montana. A mother who refused to watch her children freeze. A woman who looked down when everyone else looked up and found salvation in the steady warmth of the earth itself. Her name was Dorothea Blackwell. She built beneath the wind, and in doing so, she changed the world.